Today's episode has been brought to you by OfferingTree. You've heard me talking about OfferingTree before because this is my favorite all-in-one platform for yoga teachers. So if you are thinking that you want to build a website or integrate a scheduling software with your existing website, if you need to schedule classes and you need Zoom integration, or you want to get a video course or membership online, make sure to check out OfferingTree. And if you'd like a special discount that is for our podcast listeners, head on over to offeringtree.com/Shannon. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here today. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm still practicing how to share my social location thanks to our podcast with Rauda back in episode 266. And as I'm practicing it, I'm realizing how uncomfortable it seems sometimes in the podcast intro. So thank you for being here and listening to me sharing my social location. I'd love to practice with you as well if you'd like to share yours. My home that I own is on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, known as the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada, where I am a citizen, and I'm really privileged to have healthcare here in Canada. So it's paid for when I need it, I can use it. I'm a cisgender middle-class woman living in a white, average-size, able body. I speak English, I went to college. My family does have a history of mental health issues, and so I make therapy a priority, and I actually get it on the calendar ahead of time, thanks to an upcoming podcast guest that we had on talking about how it's nice to do that ahead of time. And a random fact about me, because I've been sharing those on the podcast lately, is that I set this little reminder on my calendar to check in with myself around this goal that I set about 90 days ago on having no screens between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m., not being on my computer screen or my phone or anything. And when this reminder popped up, I was like, oh, shoot, right. Yeah, I'm not doing that. So how's that going? Not very well. And it also was reminding me, like, why did I start this in the first place? And I actually had a couple of times this morning where I thought, it's worth trying that again. I really enjoyed doing that. So I just wanted to share that with you in case you're setting goals for yourself. And in case you go to check in, you think, wow, where did that go? That goal that I set a while back. Also, maybe you have tips on how you make goals stick. If so, reach out and tell me. I usually can do it. It depends on the goal, though. Obviously, with this one, I got away from it, and that's that. So I'm also a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you are connected to the information and inspiration that's going to support you as you build your unique yoga business. Because I remember what it was like to be a newer yoga teacher, to be a teacher just out of yoga teacher training, to be clipping along for a few years and have a lot of questions come up. That is why this podcast was created for you. This week, I'm really excited about our episode. We're exploring yoga philosophy. So as yoga teachers, we learn a little bit about yoga philosophy in our yoga teacher trainings, but yoga philosophy is much more than just the 8 limbs or simply the brief summary we've come across in our studies. Dr. Shyam Ranganathan is an expert in yoga philosophy, and he joins me in today's episode to share more about this topic, as well as how colonialism has influenced what we understand now as yoga philosophy. Dr. Shyam Ranganathan is the founder of Yoga Philosophy and a field-changing researcher on the study and translation of philosophy, especially South Asian philosophy and yoga. He holds a master's in South Asian studies and a master and PhD in philosophy, and is a member of the Department of Philosophy. Shyam is based out of Toronto, here in Ontario, Canada. He's a translator of the Yoga Sūtras and founded his organization Yoga Philosophy to provide support for those who are interested in answering the question, what makes something yoga? In this fascinating discussion, Shyam learns about philosophy and how it can help us to get along with each other, and why not all opinions are equally good or right. He also shares more about how Europeans misunderstood things when they studied South Asian and BIPOC communities, and how that showed up in the Yoga Sūtras and how they're translated and continue to influence how yoga is taught and practiced in the world. Today, especially here in the West. I'm saying here in the West because that's where I am. You might be like, it's not here in the West, especially over here where I am in the West. We also delve into questions of niyamas and social justice, choices and responsibility, ahimsa, dharma, self-governing, and ishvara pranidhana. This is a really rich conversation that all of us can learn from, and I'm excited to share it with you today. And I love that I can go back and re-listen, because it's one of those episodes where I feel like I was listening, when we did this interview live. I re-listened as I was making some notes about what we talked about and to do my key takeaways for all of you, and to mark some edits and things. And then I plan to go back and re-listen. It's one of those episodes. So let's dive right in and learn with Shyam. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Shyam. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us, first of all, how do I pronounce your name and what pronouns do you use?
So he, him for the pronouns, and it's Shyam. The Y is a consonant, which is barely pronounced. And I don't pronounce it, and it's probably not absolutely correct, but Shyam, but with an M is how I introduce the pronunciation.
And then how do I pronounce your last name?
Ranganathan.
Ranganathan. Okay.
Very good. Yeah, it's phonetic. It's actually the way it's spelled. So
yeah. Well, it's handy because you say it, I can repeat it, and I can also see it on your Zoom screen. This helps me a lot when I can read it as well. So before we dive right in and talk about the 8 limbs and how this relates to yoga, tell us, what is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
So my day job, I teach at the Department of Philosophy and the York. Well, I'm a faculty member of the Department of Philosophy and York Center for Asian Research at York University, and I'm a philosopher. I'm a professional philosopher. I'm a professor of philosophy. In 2019, I started Yoga Philosophy, or yogaphilosophy.com, and the idea was to bring scholarly, rigorous knowledge of yoga and philosophy to people interested, primarily yoga practitioners, right? So we are an accredited yoga school, and but it's basically yoga philosophy. Though we're expanding our offerings, so you can do Intro to Sanskrit, and there'll be more things coming in the future.
Oh, that's amazing! So just to clarify, your day job is at York University in Toronto, Ontario.
That's right.
Okay, cool. I love it. A fellow Canadian is always good to have on the podcast. And so what got you interested in this work of studying philosophy then?
Oh, yeah. I decided when I was 17 that I would become a philosopher. I was at my previous life, I was a serious student of music, and I loved music, but I found it very frustrating just to make the connections and to make things happening. And I decided philosophy was the best decision of my life, because what I loved about philosophy immediately was that it was a way to get along with people without having to agree. So I was kind of tired of being bossed around and failing everybody's expectations, right? I think a lot of racialized people who are kids of immigrants feel this way, but they feel like I certainly felt like I belonged nowhere. I kind of failed. I wouldn't live up to the expectations of what it was to be a South Asian of my family's descent, nor people also didn't quite seem to think that I belonged where I was born, and I grew up in Toronto. So philosophy was really a breath of fresh air, because nobody expects you to toe the party line, and it's all about learning how to think and reason responsibly about the challenges that we face. So that was the origins of my interest in philosophy, and I stuck with it.
I'm impressed that you had this idea at the age of 17. I mean, I have 3 kids. My youngest is now 16, and none of them have said, I want to study philosophy at the age of 17. I feel like
I was lucky. Actually, my mom has 2 M's in philosophy, so I wasn't entirely a top breaker on that score. So
right. And
so maybe there was nothing all that original about it. That's another way to think about it.
I think there is. If I think of the average 17-year-old. Okay, I also want to ask, when did you grew up in Toronto? How old were you when you moved to Canada?
I was born in Toronto.
Okay. And so this idea of like, I feel like I don't fit in, I'm curious about that. Like, not fitting in.
I think that's a pretty common experience of first generation racialized immigrants, right? Like, it would, in a way, it would be easier had I been born in someplace else in South Asia. But the common question of where you're from, it's innocent enough, right? But after a while, it kind of wears on you, the automatic assumption that you're not from here. And it's usually not the end of that. It continues on in the way people. I mean, there are so many ways that I could have made it easier on myself and others by just deciding to accept the values of settler colonialism, but the whole thing struck me as ridiculous. So I didn't really like the colonized version of being South Asian that I learned from my family and people not so much people in India, but certainly people who immigrated. Their way of retelling South Asian heritage was heavily colonized. I wasn't particularly interested in that. And I was also not particularly interested in settler colonialism. So I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. Philosophy was amazing because there's no test of values to participate. So that was really cool.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, because it's just powerful to hear people's stories of like what it was like to grow up as a Canadian and then to feel like, okay, why am I getting this question all the time? It's powerful to hear your words in this, your story in this. And I love that philosophy, what did you say? Philosophy enabled you to, somehow you said, get along with people. That really caught my attention.
You just learn that it's at first it shows you a way to interact with people where you don't need them to agree with you or to endorse what you endorse in order for you to learn how to get along with them. And then over time, for me, I felt like it really started showing what's missing in a westernized world. The West is a tradition that never liked philosophy, right? So it begins with the murder of Socrates. And Socrates is murdered. And the charges that are brought up against him is that he promotes false gods and corrupts the youth, which is another way of saying that he didn't buy the values of his society. So later on, I started to really appreciate kind of what South Asia had to teach us, not the kind of colonized version that most of us run into, but ancient South Asia, where philosophy was really just how people got along with each other. And so, thinking about decolonizing our world, I think if you're really going to be successful at it, we have to learn how to be philosophers. We have to learn to be okay with diversity and others not agreeing, and we have to learn to live with people that we don't agree with. And there are certain values that come with that, right? It's not like everything's up for debate, because if we are going to allow each other to disagree, we have to learn how to live with each other while we do that. And so that there's a lot of good work that can be done on that score, but we need philosophy there at the kind of the base level.
This is fascinating to me, and it's got my interest for sure, because I think there are some polarizing issues right now in our world.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the things that I also learned with philosophy is that just because we're okay with disagreement doesn't mean that there are no right answers, right? Like, disagreement doesn't mean that everybody's opinion is equally good. It just means that we don't talk about an issue as though you couldn't disagree about it. It doesn't follow from that there isn't a right answer, and that in fact, if we're interested in the right answer to questions, we have to understand them as explaining what we're disagreeing about. So really only start to appreciate what the right answers are to troublesome questions when we understand what the possibilities are, the different perspectives you could take, and then you're in a position to advance research, which is what happens in any research field, right? They when they make an advance, when they explain what it is that people were disagreeing about.
Yeah. When did you start to look at the 8 limbs and how that relates to philosophy and yoga? Where did that journey start with you?
Yeah, the 8 limbs came late, and even in the Yoga Sutra, it's not really a very it occupies 2 books, but it's not really a basic idea in the Yoga Sutra. So I started to fall slowly into yoga first. Well, I mean, the ideas of yoga were already in the background of my family life, and I didn't quite appreciate that until I became a scholar of yoga. But uh, I was my it was there was kind of a series of steps. First, I got interested in this weird myth uh, told over and over again by people who claim to be scholars of South Asia, that South Asians were not interested in moral and political issues. So their view is that South Asian philosophers wrote about everything except about practical questions of how to get along with other people and how to choose. And this is, of course, exactly the myth that colonizers would want to propagate in order to depict the colonized as in need of some type of remediation, right? And so then the colonial culture steps in as having the answers that these people never thought about. So I still find my jaw is always on the ground that first of all, that this was the view when I started in the 1990s, and lots of people still carry on like this. They're not interested in the question of South Asian moral and political philosophy. So I wrote about this, and so what I showed or found was that there's this one word, dharma, that everybody talks about in the South Asian tradition, and they all use it differently. And what was going on was that Westernized scholars were deciding to interpret what South Asians were saying in terms of what they believe. So they would look at what South Asians were saying when they were talking about Dharma on every particular occasion and then just swap it out with whatever they would have said in that case. And so they came to this weird conclusion that this one word has several disconnected meanings and no one's talking about ethics. But what I showed was that, well, if we use logic and if we use the same methodology that we need to be successful in philosophy, we find that they were actually disagreeing about theories of Dharma. And that was their term to talk about the right or the good, right choice, good outcome. So the options of Indian or South Asian philosophy then is a disagreement about moral and political issues, specifically Dharma. So I started that work in my master's in South Asian studies. And I did that after an MA in philosophy because I felt a little frustrated at the narrowness of the conversations that were going on. But then I was even more frustrated with what was going on in the research on South Asia. So then I kind of went back to philosophy and I did my PhD on translating philosophy. That was the topic. How do we understand people when we don't share anything like language, culture, or values? And while I was working on that dissertation, I was asked to teach the Yoga Sutra to students in an Ayurveda school in Toronto. And I said yes, but I couldn't stand any of the translation, so I had to translate the Yoga Sutra. So while I was working on my dissertation on translation, I translated the Yoga Sutra, and that's the one that's out now through Penguin, 2008. So it was there that I started to really pay attention to the details of yoga, and then I was like, oh yeah, there are these 8 limbs. And what struck me even then was how ordinary yoga practice, what people think of as yoga, in this kind of hyper-colonized world vaguely conforms to some of what the Yoga Sūtra talks about. And right, asana is the third of the 8 limbs. And most people, when they learn yoga, they learn asana, right? But it's funny, right? The asana that's talked about in the Yoga Sūtra, Sthira Sukha asana, is a still and sweet occupation of your space. Really, I think it's a more general claim about occupying the space of your life. Over
you don't
time,
think it's about bending into some pretzel?
Yeah. So later on, increasingly, so what ends up happening in the yoga tradition is that later on there are these applied yoga books like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika is like a famous one, but there are other ones. And they have like more limbs and like their yamas are like a different set of value they add. It's not exactly the same that you find in the Yoga Sutra, but these applied yoga books, they're skimpy on theory and they're big on the limbs. And increasingly, asana starts to be used as this kind of contortion thing.
Right.
And then by the time we come to the 20th century, people start talking about yoga as though the paradigm case is that contortion thing, right? And then they talk about the philosophy as an add-on. But when you look historically, the limbs were just, the way Patanjali talks about them is they're an upaya, that is a kind of remedial measure that you put in place to help you practice yoga. So the actual practice of yoga is something more basic, and the 8 limbs are there to help you practice. And somehow we've kind of forgotten what the more basic practice is, and everybody's just about not all 8 limbs. Usually it's just limb 3 to like the end. So usually the yamas and the niyamas are dropped.
Right. Okay. So a couple of questions. Well, one, I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Were you saying that because of colonization, I'm not sure I'm quite clear on that,
Yes,
you said
you're
that
right in the first part. Yeah.
in that philosophy, what was missing again? Just clarify that for
Right.
me. You were finding this frustration. This piece was missing of morals, or is that right? Ethics?
Oh, I see. Well, in the scholarship, people would say that South Asian thinkers wrote about everything except for practical questions on how to live and what to choose and how to treat people. They described these people as though all they wanted to do was just escape life. And they had no practical interest in getting along, living their life, getting along with others, choosing responsibly. It's weird, right? So if you're into yoga and if you're educated about the yoga tradition, you know that these questions were so basic, right? They're like the basic questions. And then if you read the literature, like the epics, like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, you know these people are obsessed with practical questions. And then if you look at the disagreements between early South Asian philosophers like Buddhists, Jains, Yogi, they were all practical questions about choices, right? So I remember one of my first weird outer body experiences as an undergrad. I did my undergrad at the University of Guelph, which at the time was, they had a great kind of history of philosophy program, which basically meant European history, but it didn't matter. It was great philosophy education. But I remember I went into my moral philosophy class, ethics, and then every topic that was discussed was like the tradition I came from. It was like, those are the issues that people that I come from were obsessed with. They were obsessed with questions like, when I'm making a choice, should I be concerned about the outcome and the consequences, or should I just be thinking in terms of some type of rule about what my duty is? Such basic questions of moral philosophy. But those are the questions that you find, for instance, the Bhagavad Gita. Like, it starts off that way. And then I went to the philosophy of religion. I took philosophy of religion. And then I was like, but the weird thing about moral philosophy is that South Asians weren't included. And if you went to scholarship on South Asian philosophy, nobody was talking about Indian ethics or moral and political philosophy. The view was there was none. So it was weird. So like I went to my ethics class. I'm like, all of these questions are exactly the questions that my people were obsessed with. And then I went to philosophy religion class and I didn't recognize anything. So I was being told by settler colonialism that my tradition was religion and spirituality, but it made more sense in the moral philosophy class. And the philosophy religion class, it's all about faith and mysticism and whether you could be a believer and also take science seriously. These were just weird questions that no Hindu or South Asian that I ever knew ever cared about, right? They were just the last things. It's just not part of the tradition, right? What was part of the tradition were all these practical questions about choice and responsibility. But the way the story is configured in the academy, right? We learn about moral political issues from the European tradition, and every other tradition is just religion. And then what ends up happening is that it's studied non-Western, basically BIPOC traditions of brown people and black people are studied by people who are not trained in philosophy. So they wouldn't understand the philosophy if they saw it, right? They're just studied in things like field research or Sanskrit or something like that, right? It's just not what they're interested in, and it's not what they're trained in. So we have this entire setup of white supremacy, basically, in the academy, where you're constantly being taught that all the clever ideas about how to organize your life were made up by Europeans, and the brown people, they were just all a bunch of mystics, right? So that was where my research kind of began, and I was first curious why all these people who claim to love the study of South Asia and love South Asia, they were so kind of weirdly white supremacist about it. Like it's a weird contradiction, right? And then my research started taking me further. And when I was doing my PhD on translation, I realized that all the weird views that you found in the academy about South Asia were actually a function of very central theories about meaning and thought in the Western tradition. And then these link contemporary philosophy all the way back to its Greek origin. So what you have is, I started to appreciate, is you have this tradition, the Western tradition, that's committed to, anyways, I'll stop talking soon because I've been talking for a long time. But here's,
Oh, I'm fascinated by this.
Here's the punchline. It's committed to what we could call the linguistic account of thought. So this is just a basic assumption in the Western tradition. It's the idea that thought is the meaning of what you say. And it goes back to the Greek idea of logos. So the Greeks had only one word for reason, story, account, and thought and words, logos. And so, for instance, when Aristotle says that humans are an animal with a rational principle, a logos principle in them, it also meant that humans were an animal that could speak language. And so the Greeks, they didn't draw a distinction between the two, that reasoning was this kind of chit chat that humans did. Now, the problem with this theory of thought is that if thought is the meaning of what I say, then for me to understand a thought is to understand it in terms of what I would say, right? So then I have to explain everything in terms of what I would say. And then this is the theory, this is called interpretation, where I try to explain everything in terms of my beliefs. So then as this tradition grows, it tries to explain everything in terms of itself. But of course, ideas and practices and traditions that come from outside are not going to be explainable this way. And so they're depicted as religion. So that's where we get the idea of religion. It's the rehabilitation of a Roman idea of religio, of settled practice, gets re-understood as a way to understand alien South Asian traditions. And then when the British take over, they decide they need one word to talk about indigenous South Asian religion. And so they use the Persian Hindu, which is the word for Sindhu, which is a northwest part of South Asia. So the Persians used that word to talk about South Asians. And the British decided they needed a word for all of this local religion. And so that's how we get Hinduism. And so prior to that, all you had were people disagreeing philosophically on moral and political in every issue. And then after that colonial moment, people have to identify with imposed religious identities in order to find a place in a colonized world. And that's where we are today still. It's not like colonization is over. We're living with these colonial
No,
decisions.
it certainly is not. And I feel like I feel like growing up as a white person in a very white community in Canada, i- it's like I couldn't see this for a very long time. And it's if anyone's listening and it's feeling like out of the grasp, just keep listening to various opinions on this and conversations on this, because I find that I'll learn something and then I'll be like, "Oh, this goes along really well with this other thing that I was just learning about." It's not all like you can just see it all at once.
Right. So the challenge here is the mechanism of colonialism is the explanation in terms of what I would say.
Yeah.
Right. So, and this is just a very natural way for people in the Western world to think about explanation. That's the way we're raised. How would you describe it, right?
Right.
And so the problem then is that we're kind of stuck with this narcissism unless we make an effort to really choose something else. And that's how I got interested. Yoga really started popping to me because Yoga Sūtra actually begins with the choice between two different methods of understanding or relating to what you contemplate. So on the one hand, you could take responsibility for organizing the data and then deriving explanations and being part of the project of research so that your freedom is respected, or you just explain things in terms of what you would say. That's the way I'm paraphrasing. It's a kind of very rough translation, but the Yoga Sutra starts off with two methods, and one of them is yoga. And yoga is not explaining things in terms of what you say. It's about taking responsibility. Yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, taking responsibility for your interaction, even with what you're contemplating, to
Can you
ensure that
give us a tangible example of a human choosing just explaining it the way I say it type of thing,
yeah,
or doing the research? Like, can you think of an
yeah,
example?
sure, for sure. So I'm going to start off with the academic example, but then I'll kind of retell it in terms of like your friend coming over. Okay, so the academic example just is like all these Western scholars, quote unquote, right? They read South Asian stuff, and then every time some South Asian thinker is talking about choice and responsibility, they just replace it with what they would have said in that context, right? So imagine some Buddhists, for instance, talk about the very structure of reality is comprised of dharmas. Each little aspect of reality is part of a larger system of dependent origination. And dependent origination is unselfish, it supports other things, it also kind of negates its own unselfishness. And so the Buddhists think that that's the basic story of what reality is. And then selfish beings are weird ripples or processes in this wider system of dharma who try to make choices selfishly, and it doesn't work out for them, right? Because that selfishness is a kind of subjective approach to life, where the objective fact is everything is just causally related, and the macroscopic objects that we think are real are really just processes, right? So, we look at a cup and we think the cup is real, but really it's a process of a whole bunch of atoms interacting with each other, right? So that's the way the Buddhists saw it. But they described all those micro elements as dharmas. So Western scholars come along and say, oh, well, if they're talking about little atoms of existence, I wouldn't call that an ethical. I would call that an atom, right? And so piecemeal by piecemeal, they would take away this insight, this lovely vision Buddhists had about how we're all locked in to systems of obligation and choice, and that really for us to make this work, we have to get over our selfishness, right? That was kind of a driving argument. And so what the Westerner does is she kind of replaces each claim about Dharma with what she would have said. Oh, well, Buddhists in this case are talking about teachings of the Buddha. I would call that religion, right? In this case, they're talking about good things to do, and as in avoiding bad things. I would say that this is about avoiding sin or something, right? It just systematically replays until the story can't be told. That theory of right choice and good outcomes is gone. It's just filtered out. So imagine a friend of yours comes over and she wants to tell you about all the good things that she experienced on a trip. And every time she used the word good, you just replaced it with what you would have said in that circumstance. So let's say she had an espresso she really liked. She said it was really good espresso, but you hate espresso. So you would say, when she's saying good there, she just meant espresso. Right? And then she tells you about how, she had a really bad stay on the beach because there was too much sun, right? And so instead of realizing that she's talking about that was not a good thing, you would say, oh, that's just staying on the beach or something like that. So you can imagine this narcissism where instead of just listening to this account your friend has about the good and bad things that she's, at least according to her, right, that she's come in contact with, you just systematically replace what she says, all of her judgments, with what you would have said. So that's what academics who study South Asia, with very rare exceptions, do. And that's why the common view was, that there's just no discussion about these moral and political issues in the South Asian tradition, right? So there are very few exceptions. I'm the only person that I know of who's written on the topic of Indian ethics through multiple volumes. And I've had the good fortune to work with authors and edited volumes that worked on specific traditions. And, we organized it so that we were able to show these themes of engagement. But the thing that makes this possible is this willingness to listen to people you might not agree with, right? It's just being open to that. And the mentality of the colonizer is that they can't do that, right? That's why they take over because they simply won't tolerate another perspective.
This is making me wonder, how do we get to that place? I have been thinking about that a lot lately, of like, as a white person, how did my ancestors get to the place where they could actually come into countries? I was explaining this to my kids. Just like walking in and being like, yeah, you can't do any of these things you're doing because they're just not fitting. They're just not okay. I've come over to your place and you can't do this.
For sure. Well, I mean, residential schools were going on until the 70s, right?
Yes, I had a friend, and yeah.
So I think, one of the things that I point out in my research is that this linguistic model of thought is really to blame. So in China right now, right, the Uyghurs and Tibetans, the Uyghurs are being subject to extermination, right? They're in concentration camps. So Confucius actually, the linguistic model of thought is controversial in China, but you can find it in the writings of Confucius. And Confucius was very influential on cultures in East Asia. Taoists reject the idea that language is anything but a lie. But one of the weird ways that this ends up being combined in China is that the Chinese language is actually a written language. It's an orthography, right? And spoken versions of Chinese are not all of them mutually intelligible. But as long as everybody uses the written orthography, they can communicate. But people like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, they don't use it. So they have to be brought in line. This is the psychology, right? And standardized so that they become good Chinese citizens. So we saw in Canada with residential schools, right? The whole aim was to turn First Nations people into Europeans, like brown Europeans, right? They weren't allowed to speak their native language, and they had to learn to speak French or English. And it's the same model of thought, right? It's this idea that, well, what it is for us to get along is to share this cultural outlook that's given to us by our language, right? And so I think if you have that view, right, you're always going to think you're right because your culture tells you you're right, right? And because you're committed to that, you're like, oh, they're just confused. We have to go explain it to them, right? Or force them to be like us. And it's really instructive that not all cultures had this theory of thought, and the ones that didn't never left home, right? They never left home to go tell other people how they're supposed to live. So it's a weird theory of thought. It's also an anti-yoga theory of thought because it leads to this idea that we need to understand in terms of our experiences or what we would say. And that's exactly what you reject when you practice yoga. You don't understand in terms of your experiences or what you would say. You understand in terms of your responsibility to organize, to make room for yourself and other people in your life. And so your cultural language aren't, you could use them, but you're not supposed to believe what it teaches you, right? That's just foolish.
Can you expand on this a little bit more of how this is how that isn't yoga when we go in and we make people conform to our belief system?
Sure. So, I mean, part of this is just, it relies on a historical understanding of what yoga, the philosophy, is. So, yoga, the philosophy, was born in South Asia at a time where people were becoming suspicious and they started objecting to the idea that the whole world is this system of external forces and rules. So the early Vedas, the early part of the tradition in northern India, that's the way they saw it. They saw the world as governed by external forces of nature. And they thought that we had to conform to that system by sacrificing to the gods to make room for ourselves, right? And that's a way of understanding in terms of what you experience, right? Because like if you look around, that seems true. There are all these forces, the rain, the wind, the sun. And like if we don't try and accommodate ourselves to these forces, we'll get killed, right? We'll die from starvation or disease or all sorts of natural misfortunes can befall. There are lots of problems with that point of view, but the biggest problem is that if we don't control that external world, then there's no way for us to really make sure that we have a place in it, right? Because it's always out of our control. So there's no sense to trying to conform yourself to some external set of expectations. Instead, flip it and see life as something that you have to live responsibly so that you make room for yourself as a person. So whereas the external world can be explained in terms of causality, this is nature, prakriti, persons or purusha have to understand themselves in terms of choice and responsibility. Now, if I'm going to understand myself in terms of choice and responsibility, I can't simply believe everything I hear and experience because that's irresponsible, right? Like it might not be true. Even if it's true, it might not be good for me. Like it's true that there's a COVID-19 pandemic, but that doesn't mean I should accommodate myself to the pandemic. I should be doing whatever I can to destroy the pandemic, like put an end to it, right? But if we simply just expect to understand ourselves in terms of what we're experiencing, then we start to shrink into a smaller and smaller space where all the problems of the outside world are dictating what little room there is left for us. And that's exactly what yoga rejects, right? Yoga's like, no, it might be true, but it's not responsible for you to try and conform to that. So you have to think in terms of a practice that will convert your life into one that's explained not in terms of external influence, but in terms of choice and responsibility. And then as you start to get better at that practice, more and more of your life is explained in terms of choice and responsibility and not explained in terms of outside influence. And then when you're totally successful, the Yoga Sūtra says you go into a place called Kaivalya. That's just, there's no longer external influence. It's all choice and responsibility.
How does this then connect to the eight limbs? And please feel free to correct me on this. Like, I really, and this is through my own lens, I just have felt like for me, the eight limbs is like kind of the foundation of my yoga. is that a narrow way to think of things? Like I think of these are all of the aspects of my practice, and this is kind of my scope of practice as how I teach, what I include in
Sure.
this.
Okay. So yes and no. It's not. This is not a. It's either yes or no. It's a kind of yes and no. So first, it's important to understand what yoga as a practice is defined as. So yoga is about us being the explanation of our life in terms of choice and responsibility. And so the essence of that practice is devotion to ishvara. So ishvara is the ideal of personhood. And so ishvara is not constrained by past choices, mistakes, and also free to determine its future. So what potentially does at the start of book 2 is he defines yoga in terms of 3 kriyas. So if you want, and kriya means action. So if you want to understand like the most succinct account of yoga as a practice, we go to that. It shows up again in the 8 limbs in the niyamas. So it gets included there, but it's really important for us to acknowledge these 3 on its own. First is devotion to sovereignty or ishvara. And then there's tapas and swadhyaya. And tapas and swadhyaya are both ways to practice the 2 essential traits of ishvara. So the essential traits of ishvara are basically being unconservative and self-governing. And so tapas is the practice of being unconservative. You challenge yourself through exertion so that you're not bound by old habits, etc. And then swadhyaya is about examining and determining your own values and choices. And so when we're practicing yoga, we're working on being sovereign by practicing being sovereign. Now, the 8 limbs are the kind of, they're like the buttresses or the, there's more than one way to look at it. One way you could look at it as it's an implementation of these 3 basic practices, but they're also kind of rails to help us not fall off the practice. And that's why before we even get to the core 3 kriyas of yoga, the first limb is yama. And yama is about destroying systemic harm to allow for the facts. And those facts consists of people not being deprived of what they need, personal boundaries being respected, and you not hoarding or colonizing. So ahimsa is about that kind of disruption of systemic harm. Satya, the truth, the facts. And what are the facts like? Well, people aren't deprived of what they need. Asteya, personal boundaries, brahmacharya, and you haven't kind of enriched yourself by some kind of colonial process, aparigraha. So you do that before you even get to the 3 kriyas of yoga, right? And potentially says that these are universal obligations. Everybody should be doing that. So once you have started your project of political activism to create space for people, then you move in the niyamas to your personal commitment to the practice of yoga. So this is where we get the 3 kriyas repeated again: ishvara, pranidhana, tapas, and swadhyaya. And then there are 2 virtues that are added. We have to be content with the practice, santosh, and then against anti-yoga practices, saucha. Now, ironically, these are the 2 limbs that are usually not taught when people are taught yoga, right? The first thing they're taught is now we will do some postures, right? The idea is that no, you actually have to create space for the practice of yoga. And that's a moral political space. It's about how you relate to other people. It's about how people can relate to each other in public space. And then your own commitment. And then after that, you can start working on asana, which is you're starting to now own your space as a practitioner, right? And then there are further limbs that kind of help you add layers to your practice. But the practice is always the 3 kriyas. And the 3 kriyas are only possible if you've made this moral political space for people.
Okay, I have some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Hey there, I'm popping in here for a moment, connected yoga teachers, just to check in and see if you're ever like me and you sometimes procrastinate or put things off on the tech side of your business. I completely understand. I was just thinking today how one part of an older website that I have is very outdated. It makes me cringe a little bit to even share that here on the podcast because I'm worried that somebody's going to go and check it out and be like, why does Shannon have something with an event from 2018? So we all have moments like this in our business. When you have a business, when you're an entrepreneur, you want to do the things that you really love doing. I love interviewing podcast guests, and I don't always love doing the tech side of my website. And that is why I tell yoga teachers about OfferingTree, because I see how easy it is for them to create a website, update it, and not get stuck in all of the weeds of tech. I am not joking when I say that you can get your classes and lessons all scheduled and set up in 30 minutes with OfferingTree. Everything is integrated for you on there, like Zoom, time zones, video software. It's all there and ready for you to take away the headaches around tech. If you want to try out OfferingTree for free, go over to offeringtree.com/Shannon, and that will also get you a discount for our podcast listeners only. Alrighty, let's get back to our interview with Shyam. First of all, I want to get into the 3 kriyas that you talked about. Kind of like, can you explain it to me like I'm in grade 5? Because,
Sure.
Well, first of all, just the pronunciation of ishvara.
Ishvara.
Isn't there another part to it that starts with P?
Pranidhana, that's devotion too. So
Okay.
Ishvara is the Lord or is the sovereign, and Ishvara Pranidhana is devotion to Ishvara.
So as a Westerner, when I learned this in my first yoga teacher training, I was like, oh, this seems like this is religion. Like this seems like a devotion to God or something.
Great. Fantastic. I'm glad you brought this up. So two moments in our decolonizing efforts here. Religion is just the word or the category developed by the Western tradition to marginalize anything not Western. Second of all, because it interprets, so everything from South Asia is religion. It's inescapable because that's all religion is. So, I mean, I think we need to really get over that worry, because really that's like, it's a bit analogous to saying, oh, why are you bringing up race? We should all just not see color or something like that, right? Well, we can't because of colonialism. But also, right, maybe it's not such a bad thing, and I'll get around to that in a second. Second, more importantly, when people in a westernized world try to understand even religion, which is just everything else, they try to understand it in terms of theories that are familiar to them, right? So most people will assume some type of theism they learn from, say, Christianity or Islam or Judaism, and they'll use this as a model to try and understand what yoga is teaching us. So one of the useful outcomes of doing the kind of logic-based research that I do is that I've shown that there are actually 4 basic ethical theories. There's 3 that we're familiar with in the Western tradition, and 1 that we're not, and the 4th one is yoga. So the 3 other ethical theories are: the first is virtue ethics, the idea that the right choice is just the outcome of a good character, or someone who has a good character. And theism is a version of virtue ethics, and the theist thinks that there's an ultimately good person whose choices are what we should follow, and that's God. Okay. Then the other 2 theories are: one is consequentialism, the idea that there are these good ends that justify my choices. Then there's deontology that kind of inverts that. There are lots of good things to do, but only some of them I have reason to do, and those are my duties. Yoga inverts virtue ethics. So since theism is a version of virtue ethics, whatever we find in yoga is the opposite. So Ishvara isn't good, Ishvara is right. And that's an extremely important distinction, because the idea then is that as a practitioner of yoga, I don't need to know someone who's good at yoga to learn yoga. I have to be devoted, and I don't even have to be good at it to practice yoga. I have to work on being devoted to the ideal of the right choice as a practitioner. And that's what ishvara is. And then as I'm devoted to that ideal, I transform my own performance into something that's more successful over time. So whereas the theist thinks you start off with the good character of God, and that leads you to the right choice. Yoga is the opposite. You start off with the right choice, and then over time, that leads to a good outcome through practice. So yeah, for sure. I mean, I used to, when I was younger, I thought that this is all like theism. I had all these same reactions, right? And then I remember just doing my work and my research, and being kind of methodologically strict about understanding the options. And then I just realized that we've all been like this. We've all been lied to, right? The way all of this is presented,
Right.
it always seems like, oh, it's just another version of something familiar, when it's just the opposite. It's something completely different from what you're familiar with. So for the yogi, you have to take responsibility for choosing. You can't blame God for your choices or something, right? Like, that's your work.
Right.
And whatever choice you make, that's your choice. It's nobody else's choice. So all the evils that come with just that, finger pointing and then deferring responsibility to your religious leader or God or something, there's no room for that in yoga. It's just you and your practice.
And the other two, tapas, like I always understood this as like, get up, do your practice, like just stick to it.
Yeah. Well, it literally means heat production. And the idea is that it's exerting. But what is exerting except for whatever involves friction, pushing against boundaries, right? So it's a metaphor for self-challenge on the whole. So yes, doing your practice, that falls into, but also for doing philosophy, trying to understand things that you're not used to, right? All of that is tapas too, right? All of that is you're getting over your prejudices that stop you from growing, your habits that are a limit to your own sovereignty.
Right. Not just the physical body.
No. It doesn't say that ever. It just says, it does says that tapas reduces impurity in body, but that's not how it's defined. It's the idea of producing heat, right? And then you're like, well, how is heat produced? And it's about change and transformation and friction, and all of those ideas are involved.
Okay. And the last one was
Swadhyaya, which literally means self-study. It also is sometimes read as studies of the Vedas, because the end of the Vedas, there's lots of talk about the self, Atma. But over time, I see that really what that means is self-determination, because for yoga, when we study something, we're responsible for influencing it. We can't just believe whatever we experience. We have to organize what we're understanding, right? Exactly the way a researcher just doesn't go out and kind of believe the symptoms that she sees. She has to take all the data of lots of people and symptoms and then organize them, and then the knowledge starts to happen, right? So if you're going to do this with yourself, you are self-determining. And Patanjali says that you recognize a bond with your Ishtadevata, your chosen values or deities. When you practice, that is, you start to understand the values that you've set for yourself, right? You understand your responsibility in choosing the things that are important to you as you self-govern, but you also determine what's important to you, right? So once again, you can't blame anybody else for what's important to your values. It's you. It's an essential part of the practice.
And so then you talked about the niyamas well, what I heard today in a different way. Maybe it was talked about before. The way you talked about it made me think of this question that I've been seeing pop up all over the last couple of weeks on social media of like, is yoga connected to social justice, or is it dangerous when people who haven't been practicing yoga just step out and into social justice? Or no, yoga is not social justice. Yoga is a personal practice. And I feel like all of those questions now are in what you said about the niyamas, about making this space.
So
To
that's the
me,
niyamas.
right.
So the yamas, so the ahimsa. So in the ancient world, there were different views on what ahimsa looks like, non-harm. So the Jains are related but opposite. They were actually virtue ethicists. They are. They're still. It's not like they're gone. They're still Jains, but they think that their virtue is an essential element of the self, and so that we have to get rid of all this confusion of action to some original deep virtue we have in us. And so non-harm for them is a way to reconnect with that intrinsic virtue, but that means that you don't harm anything. So ahimsa is just about not doing something bad. But for yoga, we are not intrinsically virtuous. We have to create our virtue by our own self-challenge and owning our own choices, right? We become virtuous, but that doesn't explain, for instance, if I'm a really good musician, that's great, but it doesn't happen overnight. It happened because I practiced. And so then the explanation for why I'm so freaking good isn't because that I'm a good musician, is that I have all these years of practice behind me. That's what makes me really good, right? So yoga is that view, but with respect to people. You can become a good person, but the explanation of what makes you good is the practice you put into being a person. And that just doesn't happen overnight either. Now, because we're not trying to, because everything's about activity, we can't think about ahimsa as not doing something bad. We have to rather think about it as disrupting systemic harm. And so then the way that the 8 limbs are set up is that when I take that as my first step, I create a public space that's safe for people to work on their own sovereignty. So people like to use the word social justice. Now, there's actually a historical connection to all this, right? So Gandhi in his collected works cites Patanjali hundreds of times as the source of his political theory of nonviolent civil disobedience. And then, of course, Gandhi was very influential on the thought of Martin Luther King, who was a luminary in the American Civil Rights Movement. And then, Black Lives Matter, all that inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement. So it actually all goes back to the Yoga Sūtra. And so when people talk about social justice now, I'm like, no. Patanjali actually talks about this in book 2. He says that, when you meet up with people who advocate violence, you have to appreciate that that's a result of trauma. It's not like they have a reasoned idea. They are acting as a function of trauma. And that trauma is reducible to the poor choices they made. And so unless you appreciate that that's what's going on, you're not going to be able to respond. You have to rather respond on the basis of ahimsa. And what that does is it forces other people to renounce their hostility. That was the blueprint for nonviolent civil disobedience, right? It's not that you make people feel good about themselves. You force them to deal with their stuff, right? And then what they learn is to get over all of their issues and realize that it wasn't such a big deal after all, allowing you to ride on the bus or sit where you want to sit, right? All of those rules of violence were a result of their own fears that came from bad choices that they were making. So, all this social justice stuff, I mean, it's a great word, but really it's just yoga. It just goes back to Patanjali. I'm not surprised that people are bringing this up now. I think what's definitely wrong, just on pure scholarly grounds, is the idea that yoga is just this thing about you sitting in your, something you do on the mat by yourself. That wasn't ever yoga. That's just this weird colonized thing, right? Where you don't criticize systemic harm. You just accept it as something you have to live with.
Right. And this is done in many ways. we have an article coming out soon that Crunch on our team wrote about the ban on yoga in Alabama schools. And
Yeah,
many
yeah.
people said, well, it's progress. It's progress. Okay.
What way? Oh, it's progress because they're not teaching yoga?
Because they were thinking about allowing yoga in, but not with Sanskrit, not with this and not with that. Basically, like only parts of it that we're comfortable with, you can bring
Right.
in.
Yeah.
That bill didn't get passed, but it's interesting how we saw the conversation happening. And I even felt it in myself. Like, well, it's like kind of yoga can get in there. Isn't a little bit of yoga better than no yoga? I'll have to share that article with you when
Yeah,
it comes out.
yeah. Yeah, no, those are interesting questions. I mean, I think, yeah, yeah. It just seems like there are bigger problems, right?
Yes.
The bigger problem is just this fear of different things and different practices, right? That's the enemy of you. That's what yogis are supposed to be. We are supposed to have the insight that that's a result. That's a result of fear based on bad decisions. So those people acting that way, they're actually they're acting out their trauma. And so xenophobia is a kind of trauma-based behavior.
Just to clarify that,
yeah,
the I'm going to say predominantly white lawmakers
yeah,
in Alabama are feeling a fear,
yeah,
and it's
for
based
sure.
in trauma.
Right. Well, the fear is the trauma, and it's a result of a bad decision, right? It's a bad decision where what they've done is they've identified with their experiences. And what are their experiences? White supremacy. That's what they've experienced. And they're scared. They're scared of what life would look like without that white supremacy. What am I except for just privileged and lucky to be who I am by virtue of nothing I've ever done, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty frightening when that's all you've ever managed to do, right? So I think we need to understand that that's actually a kind of trauma-based behavior. It's just, there's a lot of talk about trauma these days in yoga teaching. And I mean, I like that people are talking about it, but it's weird because there's no yoga without an understanding of the kleshas, which are the afflictions. It's what book one of the Yoga Sutras is about. Yoga is about understanding how to live a kind of a trauma-free life, an unafflicted life. So there's no yoga practice that isn't informed by trauma. So whenever I see this, like I appreciate people are trying to say this is important, but I think we need to call out this weird idea that I could do yoga and not understand these things, right? You're not doing yoga if you're not working on understanding how there is a way to live life on the basis of trauma, and then there's an alternative, which is on the basis of choice and responsibility. And certainly all the white supremacists right now, that they're, like the insurrection, that was all trauma-based behavior, right? The whole thing. People were scared, and when people are scared, they do really bad things because they don't think about the consequences or whether it's going to work out. They're operating from panic.
Right. That's really helpful to think of it that way, especially when we're in the situation where we think, what is happening? Where are these people coming from? That's a question I like to ask people, actually. What's the fear? What's the fear underneath this, really? Okay, so to get back to the 8 limbs, and is this, I guess I want like the answer of, is the 8 limbs yoga, or where does it fit in there? Or
Sure. So if you're really going to take all the 8 limbs, then I'd say yes, because the 3 kriyas are in there. Western colonized white supremacy yoga starts with asana and leaves aside the yamas and the niyamas because those challenge white supremacy and colonization. So, this is the yoga where I'm always amazed at people kind of displaying their pictures of like violence is food, right? I'm just going to say it on Instagram or something, right? Like it's one thing to know that you've got things you've got to overcome and work on, right? So I think it's not like being a yogi means that you just eating plants or something. The idea is that you have to be challenging yourself to be leaving aside systemic practices of harm, right? So, if you're just starting out yoga, You've got to start working on things like your diet. You have to start thinking about the impact that your choices have on other people. And people in the yoga tradition, and there's a good explanation for this, are not just humans, just anything that can benefit from its own sovereignty as a person. In the Western tradition, because thought is language, there's this connection with personhood and being a language user. And so it's from the Western tradition we derive this anthropocentrism. So I see, when I see westernized yoga, I see it as a way to try and appropriate yoga and leave out anything that would be critical of common practices in the Western tradition. So you're not gonna talk about things like animals, non-human animals, and the environment, and people in other countries who are suffering, right? You're just going to talk about peace of mind and how your yoga will, I don't know, make you feel good about yourself or something like that, right? So you jump over the first two limbs that really bring home this idea that you have to be responsible for the world you live in. You just don't kind of accept the things you've experienced as setting out the parameters. And then you have to start working on that, and then you can start thinking about asana, right? But with the kind of the westernized yoga, we jump over all of that stuff, which is really the basis of yoga, and then just think about yoga as a kind of modality of wellness, right? And then it's all there to serve your further ends you have of the kind of lifestyle you want to live, right? And so you see people posting all sorts of things that just make me think they're not thinking about systemic issues at all. They're not thinking about how their dietary choices or things they're supposed to be coming to terms with. They're just thinking, I'm living this kind of scenic life, and here I am in this pose, right? Which is kind of this Instagram yoga thing. So anyways, that's kind of where we are with yoga education, right? So I think if you're going to take all 8 limbs, then yes, you're going to do yoga, because you're going to be forced to deal with the kind of moral and political issues in the niyamas. You're going to have to own your practice in the niyamas. And then that provides a context in which you can start doing things for yourself, like asana, pranayama, and meditation, right? But, and this is the topic of a talk I recently gave in the 24-hour Yoga Global Marathon, was that really the main point of yoga is this moral transformation where you move away from the smallness of selfish thinking, because that's a limit to your sovereignty. So the more kind of small and selfish you are in the way you understand your options, the more self-limiting you are with respect to the possibilities of your own life. That's counterintuitive. We think that we have to protect our small selfish self to have a good life. Really, it's the opposite. We have to get over that, because that's a limit to being free. So I'm all for all 8 limbs, if you include all of them, right? In the
Don't
first
forget
two.
them. You say the word sovereignty a lot, and I feel like you clarified that in the 24-hour yoga marathon. Will you talk to us about, because I feel like
Sure.
sovereignty has been thrown around this year in
Yeah, for
terms of
sure. Yeah.
another meaning to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, we have to use English. We're talking English, so we're trying to correlate English words that we can use, and this is the important thing. We're using them to explore an idea that was articulated with the Sanskrit ishvara. So it's often translated as Lord, but a Lord is also someone who's sovereign, right? So the idea was already there. Now, in philosophy, sovereignty plays a really important role in a lot of moral and political philosophy, right? Because a lot of moral and political philosophy, especially, actually even going back to Plato, a lot of times there's this interest in, well, what is it to be self-governing, to be on top of myself, responsible for my own choices? And if I can come to terms with that, that has something to do with being sovereign, right? I'm not doing things as an instrument of someone else, right? I'm doing things myself because I decided to. But this is part of what it is for me to be responsible, right? Now, a lot of people kind of use the settler colonialists use sovereignty to talk about just kind of deciding the rules of their life, and everybody else has to come to terms with it. But the yoga criticism is that's not sovereign, because that's just selfish, right? Selfishness limits your own imagination of what's possible for your life. And so when people, adopt settler colonialism and they start talking about sovereignty, it's like a performative takedown. They're kind of showing you what's wrong about their perspective. So, I point out that we just need a word. Sovereignty is a useful word because I think it helps us think about what is it that we're supposed to be devoted to. Now, if sovereignty is not the same as being selfish, then in being sovereign and being devoted to sovereignty, I get over my selfishness that stops me from caring about you, right? Like that limit to my ability to take other people into consideration in my own choices disappears as I'm devoted to ishvara. And in the tradition, that was always depicted this way. People who are devoted to ishvara are kind and compassionate to everybody else, and they're the friend of everybody else, right? It's always described this way, that people who are like this, right, they have this remarkable moral insight into the suffering and difficulties that other people undergo, and they're also helpful and friendly. This is all part of. These are just outcomes of that theory. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just there is a moment in Western philosophy in the modern period as Europeans were colonizing the West, where a lot of political thinkers started to think about sovereignty in terms of property. And so they started thinking about individual rights in terms of property rights. And I think a lot of the settler colonial ideas about sovereignty come from there. You go someplace and you just decide that it's yours. and then that defines who you are. This is mine.
Right.
Without any consideration for the fact that people have been here for thousands of years, and like, that's ridiculous. You don't really own this. And just because you stick your flag in the ground doesn't mean anything, right? Except the way to make it real is by violence, right? It's such an empty claim to just put a flag in the ground, so you have to back it up with violence, which is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all small thinking. That isn't really devotion to ishvara.
Right. This is so helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. I feel like I could we could be here all day chatting about this. I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and I'm curious to also hear from our listeners. And if our listeners want to study more with you, what is your website? Where should they go?
Thank you. So yoga philosophy, oneword.com. So yogaphilosophy.com. That's my website. I'm also on Instagram, yogaphilosophy_com. But my courses, you can find out more about the courses that I offer at yogaphilosophy.com.
Perfect.
And you can sign up for the email list where you get free yoga philosophy sent to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. What is one thing right now that really has caught your attention in terms of yoga and philosophy? What's one new thing that you're looking at or question that you have?
Well, for me, actually, I didn't think anybody would be interested in what I had to share. Because when I looked around the yoga world, I just saw all this kind of weird, kooky guru worshipping, and like people liked all the ridiculous stuff. They liked people pretending to be South Asian and talking as South Asian as they could. And the whole thing just seemed like a big joke to me. And I couldn't imagine that anybody would be interested in what I had to offer. And I find it really interesting that there are serious practitioners of yoga who, by virtue of their own practice, have already been doing this kind of work where, like, when they hear what I'm talking about, it clicks, right? Because they themselves have actually been practicing yoga. They haven't just been doing this kind of weird Instagram thing where it's just all about kind of the lifestyle, right? Like, they've actually been practicing yoga. I'm not saying don't post to Instagram, but also practice yoga. A lot of times I feel like for some people, that's it. It's just what they could kind of get into the frame in that beautiful exotic locale, right? Like, yoga is like everyday life, right? And you don't see too many pictures of that kind of practice when you're walking down the street, right? That's so uninteresting, but that's me practicing yoga, right? Anyways, I guess that's that for me has really captured my imagination, right? That there are lots of people who by virtue of their practice have been actually working on themselves. They want to learn, and they're not really interested in this kind of hokey namaste stuff, right? They really want to actually practice yoga, and they know that's not the same as just pretending to be South Asian or something. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, it comes back to like exactly what you said. I don't know if I can reiterate this very well, but when we show up and we have that and we're practicing and we're doing the yoga, the actual yoga, then we're expanding ourselves a little bit more. We're kind of pushing those boundaries and hearing different things.
For sure.
Thank you for sharing all of this today. I'm excited about this, and I feel like this is going to be one of those interviews where I go back and listen again. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Oh my goodness, Connected Yoga Teachers, I want to hear from you. What were your key takeaways in today's episode? Thank you again, Shyam. As I said in my intro, this is one of those episodes where I could go back and re-listen and learn new things as I go. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us here today on the podcast. One of my key takeaways in this episode was when Shyam said yoga is all about taking responsibility, and how the Yoga Sutras start off with talking about taking responsibility. I've been looking at this with some of my own personal relationships. As I said earlier in my intro, I fully believe in therapy, and I love when I see my therapist and she really digs into, I get in there and I want to vent away about something that's just really bugging at me. And then there's this place of validation of my feelings, and also the look of, all right, let's dig in and take responsibility. Where's your responsibility in this, Shannon? So I really appreciate that this is also so tied into yoga. Another key takeaway for me in this was when Shyam was talking about ahimsa, and it not just about being non-harm, but also it being about disrupting harm. And we have some more podcasts coming out soon where we're really digging into, self-care for us as entrepreneurs, but also caring for others around us. And sometimes that means social justice issues. And so this was a good reminder for me and a good question for me to sit with. How can I disrupt harm? If you have thoughts about today's episode, send us a voice message. I love to get voice messages. Those go right to my email inbox, and I try and look at those first. If you go over to the connectedyogateacher.com, on the homepage, there's a button over on the right-hand side. It allows for 90 seconds of talking. If that's not long enough, just leave multiple messages. That's totally fine. If you would rather share your thoughts in text form, you can do that over on our show notes page, theconnectedyogateacher.com/269, or in our Facebook group if you want to have more of a discussion in there. Let us know your thoughts in there. Tell us what episode you were listening to. It's a great place to continue the conversation. Alrighty, I also want to give a huge shout out of thank you to Laura Fowler-Massey for leaving me a voicemail a while back. I was saving this one to play on the podcast, and let me first share it, and then let me tell you what I'd like to say back to Laura. So let's hear the message that Laura left.
Hi, Shannon. It's Laura Fowler-Massey checking in with you. I just turned on the latest podcast, and I'm looking forward to podcast 249. I'm looking forward to listening to it, but I had to pause it just when you said that you were listening to Braiding Sweetgrass and you were loving it. I'm pretty sure I was one of those people that recommended it to you. And if I didn't, I certainly would have, because I loved that book so much. I have listened to it twice, and I know it'll just be something like an annual book to come back to time and again. So powerful, so beautiful, so much to learn. So I'm glad you're really enjoying it, and I hope more people read it or listen to it. Take care. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you so much, Laura. I did just love listening to this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's one of those books. So I have this weird thing that I do. When I'm really enjoying a book, I get near the end and then I don't want to finish it. So I just need to remind myself that I can just start it all over again. I've loved listening to this book as I'm walking outside and spending time outside. So I just need to remind myself that I can do this while I'm gardening or taking some hikes this spring and summer. Thank you so much for suggesting this book, Connected Yoga Teachers. If you have other suggestions for books that really connect you with nature and learning about Indigenous people, I am all in for those suggestions. If you are wanting to hang out together, Connected Yoga Teachers, here are a couple of options. May the 10th, we are having a guest speaker inside of Pelvic Health Professionals. Dr. Christy Butler is going to be talking to us about gender-affirming surgery. So if you are working with yoga students who have a pelvis and you want to learn more about this topic and many others, head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Also, we're doing a business call at the end of May. So every single month inside of Pelvic Health Professionals, we now have a business Q&A call where I help answer your business questions, but so do all of our other members who are there on the call. It's been really an amazing thing that we started this year, and I'm excited to share that with all of you. Again, to join those, head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Next week on the podcast, if you meet me right back here where you're listening now, we are going to be talking with Libby Hinesley all about hypermobility and yoga. I cannot wait for you to hear this episode. Basically, if you are teaching yoga, this is an episode that you will not want to miss. Sending gratitude out to every single person on our team who made this episode happen. Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead, you are awesome people. Thank you so much for the work that you do in this world. And thank you, dear listener, for hanging out, for spending the time here, for really digging into the topic of philosophy and yoga and how that applies to many things in our lives right now. Thank you so much for being here. And as I close out, I'm curious to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?